Okay, so I'm getting a few questions about the short papers. They are due when? Wednesday. Don't forget, Wednesday is also the due date for your take-home exam. And hopefully those of you who have been looking at that and making some progress on that. Let me just restate. The short paper is really, in part, really there's multiple parts to this assignment. One, it's very selfish on my part. It's going to make sure that I'm staying current on all sorts of topics related to the field. And so as you find topics and you share with me papers, I oftentimes read them. And so it's very selfish on my part. Number two, though, it proves to me that you can go to the library or go online and do some research and find out a topic that maybe you don't know much about or that you want to learn more about. And so it's also multifaceted, and that I'm making sure that you are going to the literature, that you're going to the databases, and you're finding good papers, right? Those with authors and length and citations, not just someone's opinion like so many of the WebMD articles are. You're finding a good article, and you're reading it to the best of your ability, and you're highlighting it and giving me a paragraph summary of that article. That's what I'm looking for, 4 paragraphs. First paragraph on the first article. The first article does not need to have any particular source requirements, authorship requirements. It doesn't have to be of any particular length. The second and third paragraphs should be about your 2 research articles, and again, I'm being picky on those. Author, 3 pages long in the original format, and citations at the end. The fourth paragraph simply is why you chose to do it. At the end of your 4 paragraphs, you give me your 3 full-length citations. And then attached to it, your hard copy, you're going to turn in all 3 of the articles. So make sure that you have chosen articles that you can print out in full length so that you can include them with what you turn in. Does that make sense? Is that leaving anybody wondering about what to turn in? And then I gave you very specific guidelines. And only because they all look alike, I can judge them against one another. So Times New Roman, 12 font, all 3 articles at the top, your name at the top, 1-inch margins around the edges. I gave you some specific formatting guidelines. The whole thing, single-spaced, should not be more than 2 pages, right? 4 paragraphs. Those are long paragraphs if it's more than 2 pages. Something's not right. So it really, 1 to 2 pages max for your 4 paragraphs. Okay, anything else to clarify regarding the short paper? Okay, good. I look forward to reading those. I learn about some things I already know a lot about, but then I get some topics I've never heard about. So it's always really, really good for me, and I look forward to reviewing those. There's no reason, honestly, you don't get full credit. If you just read through the guidelines, make sure you've got everything taken care of, read through the little grading rubric, read through the instructions one last time before you turn it in, and just make sure you've met all the little things I've asked for, then there's no reason why you shouldn't get a 50 out of 50 on this. Okay, most students get a 49 or 50, no problem. It's only the students who have articles that don't meet the standard or do something crazy and they don't get full credit, but everyone usually gets full credit on this. Okay, so where does this bring us? In the course, we're right in the middle of the cardiovascular unit. We'll have an exam next Monday. That leaves me today to discuss the heart and Wednesday to discuss blood vessels. Both of these topics have been the discussion in lab last week. This week you're being quizzed on blood and the heart and vessels. So hopefully all of this information is beginning to come together for you and is making good sense. That vocabulary on the exam next Monday is going to include 71 through 90. Does that sound right? 71 through 90. So let me go there now. And I think I owe for you picking up at 78. Does that look right from what I did with you last time? I believe last time I got through to quad. So ramus. We know a ramus is a branch, right? So the nerves have rami, anterior and posterior rami, a branch. Back. So to rehabilitate is to bring someone back into their normal function. Rect, we know, means straight. There's a typo in there. Where's my typo on rectus abdominis? Where's my typo on my example, rectus abdominis? Should end in IS. Oops. All right. Should be IS. And then reno or renal, anything related to the kidney, you'll see reno. What other prefix do you see a lot of dealing with the kidney? Nephro, right? So nephrons, nephro this, nephro that, and renal. Reti or reti, referring to a network. The retina, what is it? We know it's a layer of the eye, but what's back there on the retina? A network of receptors for vision. The endoplasmic reticulum, what was it? A network of membranes found around the nucleus. Reticular fibers, fibers that create a scaffolding or a network, right? So reti or retinaculum or reticulum. Retro, backward or behind. The kidneys are retroperitoneal. That is, they are behind the peritoneum. We'll see that term in lab this week. Rhino, the nose, pretty easy. Rhinoplasty, a nose job. Rhino, pretty obvious to think about an animal with a big old nose structure. Rigor, stiffness, rigor mortis, remember the stiffness that follows death. Rage, excessive flow or abnormal flow. A hemorrhage would be an excessive flow of blood, right? Rhea is also a discharge or a flow. Diarrhea, what is that? Flow, dia, through, right? Way too fast, right? Things are flowing through too fast, right? So diarrhea, flow through, right, or across the digestive system. Menorrhea would be what? Menstruation flow, right? Menstrual flow. Rubro, red, ruby or rubro, red, and rugo, we see in the stomach. If you cut into the stomach, you'll see those folds, that rugae. If you look at the core of that word, you'll see the same core as in corrugated. So corrugated cardboard also has that wrinkled, sort of pleated appearance or that wrinkled appearance to it. Sarco. We saw back in the muscle unit a sarcomere. A sarcomere was that Z to Z unit with all the myofibrils and the actin and myosin overlapping fibers or filaments. And so we know sarco refers to muscle. We also saw sarcolemma, the outer layer of the muscle, or maybe sarcoma, right? A tumor of muscle tissue. Sclero, atherosclerosis, the hardening of the arteries. Sclero meaning hard. You also know that the outer layer of the eye is called the sclera. It's a white, hard, pretty tough layer. Scopo to see, microscope, seeing things that are very small. Endoscope to see things, within, right? So an endoscopy or endoscope is looking at the internal structures of the gut. Seb, grease, sebaceous glands are the oily, greasy, secreting glands of your face. And then secto to cut. If I have a prosected cadaver, it's already been cut in advance, right? Prosect. If I'm dissecting, I'm actively cutting that organ or that cadaver. Semi, half or partial, right? Semi-half, we get that one. That one's not so difficult. The semilunar valves, honestly, I don't see half a moon. Whenever I look at the heart and I'm reminded of the semilunar valves, there's 3 parts to them, not 2. I don't get it. I really don't understand where they get the name semilunar, but it suggests to us they have a half moon shape. I've yet to understand it. I need to do a better job of going back in the historical record and find out why do they call them the semilunars, because it doesn't make sense from what I understand. But we do know, right, 2 semilunar valves, the pulmonary and the aortic valves. Sept, your septic tank is quite contaminated, right? Antiseptics to fight off contamination. Septicemia would be a emia, condition of the blood, right? So septic blood, an infection of the blood. Serrate, there are muscles called the serratus anterior. We didn't learn it this semester. A serrated edge, though, on a knife, sort of a saw edge or saw-edged sword. SIA, I have no idea why I have that example. It doesn't make any sense. So SIA means, though, a condition or a process of. I'll do one more with you today. So sinus, a sinus is a cavity, a recess, a space. So we see the sin word there. Sinistro, left. If you're left-handed, you're sinister. If you, know what the opposite of that is? Opposite of sinister? Dextro, right? So from the same language. So dextro meaning right, sinister meaning left. SIS, there's what I was looking for, a state or condition. And then somato, we've seen soma, meaning the body of something. So somatic nervous system, or soma referring to body. Why the heck? We'll go one more. Sphincmo means pulse. When you're taking blood pressure, the blood pressure cuff has that dial on it called the sphygmomanometer. Sphincmo referring to what can measure the pulse. Spiro, respirometry, to respire, to expire, to inspire, all related to breathing. We know that squamous cells are flat, scaly cells. And finally, steno is a narrowing. I mentioned in lab that some newborns are born with pyloric stenosis. That is a narrowing of their pyloric sphincter. And that narrowing, they have to go in and kind of wiggle open that so that food can pass from the stomach into the duodenum. You can also have a laryngeal stenosis, a narrowing of the larynx. Any structure that's undergoing a narrowing could be described as becoming stenotic or having stenosis. So what's left? We're going to go through 90. We're going to go through about 4 or 5 more slides next time, and we will end this whole thing with tract, right, for exam number 5. And that'll be next Monday, full-length exam over the blood, the heart, and the vessels. So, again, my chapter numbers are off by 1. This should be chapter 18 for you. What questions do you have over blood? Anything at all over blood? Anything we discussed last time before I move on to the heart? Flip back through your notes. Tell me as you're looking through it, is there anything that needs to be clarified? Hopefully by now, some of you have had a chance to look at your mastering assignment for blood, interact with that a little bit. Certainly after today, you can go on and look at the heart chapter. And then after Wednesday, start looking at the vessels chapter. Those are on there as copies, so you can always do those assignments a second time for a higher score. Okay. Is there anything at all from the blood chapter? Feeling okay about blood? Blood typing. Actually, in lab today, the first group did pretty well on the blood typing section. There are a few more issues with the heart, and hopefully those who struggle with the heart and the flow of blood through the heart, that'll make more sense as we go through today's conversation. Well, let's get started then with the heart. Again, much of what you're going to hear now, we've been through as far as the structures, the flow of blood through the heart. And so kind of kick back. Focus in on the things that are new for you, or if it didn't make sense the first time, here's a chance to hear it a second time. So the average size adult, their heart is beating about 70 times per minute. Now this does change throughout our lifespan, so this is an average of an adult. And in physiology, most averages were established years ago as 25-year-old, 150-pound males. Right? So if you know a 25-year-old, 150-pound male, that's sort of what the averages were based upon. Now, medicine has gotten more inclusive, and now we have norms for women and norms for different ages. But when you read in a physiology textbook about a norm, and it's one number, not a range, but one number, typically those numbers were established in the past dealing with that idealized 150-pound, 25-year-old male. But we'll say about 75 times per minute over your lifespan. That's 7,500 times an hour, 108,000 times a day. I mean, the heart is an amazing organ. It's pumping, on average, about 5.25 liters of blood every minute, or 7,600 liters a day. Right, so massive pumping capacity, never gets a chance to take a break. The heart is the center of the cardiovascular system, of course. We know that blood is being pushed around from the heart. It is leaving through a series of arteries. Remember, by definition, arteries always carry blood away from the heart, and that blood is going to come back through a series of veins. Again, by definition, no exception there. Veins always carry blood back toward the heart. The arteries usually carry blood high in oxygen, right? We cannot say that arteries are always red. Arteries are usually red. What are the exceptions? Pulmonary arteries, which are blue, including the pulmonary trunk. There's one other exception that I mentioned in lab last week, not listed here, but in your lifetime, the umbilical artery, right? So in the fetus, the umbilical artery is an artery. It's going away from the baby's heart. It's carrying blue blood away from the baby back toward mama to get regenerated. And so that is a blue artery, right? So that's our second exception. But in your body, in any model we're going to be looking at, the only exception you need to be thinking about are the pulmonary arteries. Likewise, veins are usually going to be blue. They're usually going to be low in oxygen. Again, the same exceptions. The pulmonary veins we know are bright red, and the umbilical vein would also be carrying oxygenated blood, right? Vein going where? Toward the baby, right? So the vein going toward the baby would be carrying oxygenated blood coming in from the mother and the placenta. Arteries and veins are going to leave the heart in vessels called the great vessels. Because they are directly connected to the heart, we're going to call them the great vessels. So name for me the 4 great vessels. Superior and inferior vena cava, 2 veins. Pulmonary trunk, a blue artery. And the aorta, the red artery, right? So those are the 4 great vessels. They are going to be about 1 inch around in diameter, right? This is the garden hose. This is a good size hose coming off from or into the heart. What is the heart doing for us? Well, it's going to assure that blood is moving in a unidirectional way. And those valves that we know about in the heart are going to make sure that blood is only moving in one direction. We'll see when we get to the vessels that there are also some valves in your veins that are also going to keep that blood moving in a single direction. Those valves are going to make sure the blood is also not going backwards. What if, though, you do have a valve that begins to break down through either you're born that way, congenital, or through disease of some sort, a bacterial infection that chews away at the valve? If you have blood going back in the wrong direction, clinically we would call that a murmur, right? So a heart murmur is when blood is moving in the wrong direction. And for the most part, murmurs are going to be something that's noted in your clinical record, but perhaps it's not significant enough to warrant surgery or any kind of intervention, but something that's watched. And if that backflow becomes greater and too much blood is now making its way in the wrong direction, then we might have some issues. Now, the heart is described, you'll hear people say the right heart and the left heart, as if it's 2 different hearts, just like you heard people or will hear people say the right brain and the left brain, right? 2 things sitting side by side, working largely in concert, but not completely mirror images of each other. The 2 sides of the heart, the right side is weaker, isn't it? It's not as muscular. We've seen that in the right ventricle. It's not anywhere near as muscular as the left side. The right side is doing what? The right side is pumping blood only to the lungs. It's a pretty short distance. It doesn't need a lot of power to do that. It's not under very much pressure. The right side, the left side, however, is the workhorse of the heart. This is the side that's going to send blood all the way to your brain and to your big toe. And so it has to pump that blood under much greater force. Again, we're going to have a bunch of pressure differences in the heart. We'll talk about blood pressure in the next chapter. And we're going to have alternating cycles of contraction and relaxation. The words we're going to use for these, you already know these terms from our vocab. For for contraction, it's systole. Have we gotten there yet? We're about to get there, aren't we? So systole is the contractile phase, and diastole or diastole is going to be the time of relaxation. And you'll see those words in the notes a lot coming up. We need a certain amount of pressure to push the blood. If the blood pressure begins to drop too low, that means the brain is no longer getting the oxygen that it needs, and a person may faint or feel very weak. If blood pressure is too low, then the kidneys may no longer get the blood it needs at enough pressure to filter the blood. When people have a very weak heart, especially if they're really ill and they're in the hospital and they've got very low blood pressure, then they may also start having kidney issues because the kidneys are really, really sensitive to not enough blood pressure. And if they're not getting enough blood pressure, they scream back and say, "I'm pissed off," and they shut down. So under low blood pressure, the kidneys start failing. And you'll hear about people going into organ system failure, and the kidneys are sometimes one of those first organs when someone has a low blood pressure. We're talking really low, right? We're talking, we're in an ICU unit, we're not doing well at all. Now, pulmonary and systemic circuits. Two circuits, again, all one big cardiovascular circulatory system, but we can divide it up into the pulmonary side and the systemic side. Again, we've already said the pulmonary side is dealing with the right side of the heart. That is pumping blood over to the lungs and then back to the heart. And then the systemic side is going to be pumping blood under pressure to the rest of the body. Out the aorta, out all the arteries that we're learning to name in the body, to the tissues. So that means the pulmonary circuit's really only interested in getting the blood reoxygenated, isn't it? And the systemic side is really interested in delivering that oxygen as well as delivering nutrients, but we also don't want to forget about the delivery of hormones and the delivery of waste products back from the rest of the body. Again, oxygenated blood is going to leave the left side of the heart, out of the aorta. That blood is going to travel through a series of arteries. Those arteries are going to get smaller and smaller. We'll break this down in greater detail in the next chapter. Those smaller arteries are going to be called arterioles. That's kind of skipped over here. And then we'll eventually get down to the microscopic vessels called the capillaries. It's in the capillaries where the gases will exchange, where water will exchange, where waste products will be picked up. And then there will be a series of veins. The smallest one's called the venules, little tiny veins, that'll then merge back into veins. And what we think about the veins doing is carrying that blue blood, that deoxygenated blood, back from the tissues, carrying CO2 back to the lungs to be blown off with our respiratory gases, and bringing back waste products. Many of those waste products are eventually going to make their way to the kidneys, where they'll be filtered out of our blood in our urine. All that blood coming back is going to merge into the inferior and inferior vena cava. The superior, bringing blood back from where? Everything above the heart, basically, right? So from the head, neck, arms, all that blood's going to drain back into the superior vena cava. Everything below the heart, the trunk, legs, are going to come back up into the inferior vena cava. And the blood coming back from the heart muscle itself will drain back in to the right atrium through the coronary sinus. Right? We know about the coronary sinus, remember that? Sinus, it is a vessel, it is a vein, but it's a sinus. It's also a space, a cavity, a recess, and all of those cardiac veins come back and sort of pool in that coronary sinus. And we saw in the lab models how that coronary sinus then drains back into the right atrium. Boy, this thing happens over and over and over and over again. Tell me which side of the heart, right or left, is going to pump more blood each and every time? Nancy's saying left. Why are you saying left, Nancy?
Because it's the larger portion of the big workforce.
It is. Any other thoughts on that? You could say it's a trick question. Stephen's saying they have to be the same. And he's right. If one side if the left side was pumping out more than the right side, there'd be a big old backup somewhere really fast, wouldn't there? So while you're thinking, I appreciate your thinking, and I would think the same thing. Oh, the left side's bigger, stronger, therefore it's going to pump more volume. In essence, the two sides must be matched perfectly. Because if the right and the left ventricles are not pumping the same amount of blood, volume-wise, yes, the pressure is different, but the volume has to be the same. Otherwise, there can be a big backup somewhere. Because the circulatory system is a closed loop. It's not like we have a place to store extra blood. So in this diagram, this is what I would never attempt to draw personally, right? For those of you who have the artistic gene, you can certainly try to work this out. But this is why in lab I gave you that square heart idea. And that is the square heart gives you the four chambers, gives you the four valves, gives you the flow of blood, gives you the color of each of the sides of the heart. And this actually gives you a greater amount of detail. well, actually, it doesn't give you any more detail, it just gives it to it in a more accurate portrayal. So follow through this blood, and again, what you're seeing is that everything on the right side, right, this would be the right side, everything on the right side of the heart is going to be blue, and everything on the left side of the heart is going to be red. So you'll definitely see that here. And then we have blood going off to the body, right, off the aorta. We see red blood going away. It goes to the tissues, and we see red become blue. But look what happens when we're going to the lungs. Blood is going out blue vessels, right? Those are blue arteries. Going to the lung, where now we see blue become red. So in the capillary beds, we're regenerating, we're recapturing oxygen. So we see the blood switch from blue to red, and then comes back to the left atrium through a series of pulmonary veins, right? The pulmonary veins are red. Does that cycle make sense? Is there anything giving you difficulty with just the flow of blood through the chambers, through the valves, and around the body? Yes, ma'am.
The thing that just caught my attention was when you were talking about the capillaries. Aren't those where the, what are they called, chordae tendineae, aren't those what those are attached to?
No. Okay, so the question was, what are the capillaries? We're going to get to a better... We're going to get to better understanding of that. The capillaries are the microscopic vessels in the tissues, and every one of your cells is next to or very close to a capillary bed, and that's how it gets its nutrients and its oxygen. We'll talk more about those in the next chapter. You were asking what's attached to the chordae tendineae. Within the ventricles, that's going to be the papillary muscle, right? It's okay. Papillary, remember, means nipple-shaped, and we'll see those nipple-shaped muscles protruding off from the ventricular wall when you look at your heart muscles. This doesn't show any of that detail. Okay, so let's go back, look at the heart. Then when we get to that part where I did the square heart, I may draw the square heart on the tablet here, just so you have a replay of that from the board from lab, and then we'll quickly go through that section. But let me focus on the things that I haven't necessarily described yet. So the heart, about the size of your clenched fist. You've heard that said, and that's true. Tighten down your fist, that's about the size of your heart. It's about 250 to 350 grams or so. It's located slightly left of the midline. So for most people, not 100%, but for 99+% of the people in the world, the heart is on the left side. There are some people who have dextrocardia. That is, they have their heart over on the right side. And all their internal organs are flipped around to accommodate that. It's sort of like left versus right twisted snails. And I don't know all the genetics of that, but you know, most snails are one of the other, but there's always those rare exceptions where the snail twists in the other direction. And our body during fetal and embryological development can have that variation, and everything gets twisted the other way, and we actually end up with the heart on the right side, and all the vessels correct themselves internally. The right lung would only have then 2 chambers, the left would have 3, and it can be rather seamless in its reversal. But for most people, the heart is over on the left side, a little bit left of the midline of the mediastinum. And it's going to be rotated such that the right side of the heart is a little bit more anterior. The left side is going to be a little bit more posterior. So what does that mean? That it's more on the left side, and it's pointing down which way? Which way is the apex pointing? The apex, right, remember the base and the apex? The base is the top of the heart. What's coming out of the base of the heart? Aorta and the pulmonary trunk. And what's going in up there? Superior vena cava, right? So that's all happening up at the base. The apex is the pointy conical end of the heart. And we're going to see that the apex is going to point slightly anteroinferiorly. That means what? Toward the front, but down, right? Down in front, toward the left side. So the apex is pointing down and a little bit toward the front of your body. And let's take a look at that in situ, or in the body, how it looks. So taking a look how the heart is located within the sternum and within the thoracic cavity. There's a couple cool things here. So in lab, back in bone world, we learned about the 3 parts of the sternum. right? And that was the manubrium and the body and the little xiphoid process. And look at that, isn't that cool? The manubrium, that little widened part, is protecting what? The aortic arch and those three branches coming off from the aortic arch. Just amuse me. What are those three branches? The first one, brachiocephalic trunk. What's going to happen to that brachiocephalic trunk? It's going to split, go up the right side of the neck, right common carotid, and go right subclavian. The second little branch is what? It's going to go up the left side of the neck. That's the left common carotid. And the third branch is the left subclavian. Okay? So we've got the little manubrium there protecting the aortic arch and those major vessels coming off. That's a nice protective bony structure, isn't it? Then the body of the sternum is protecting a large portion of the heart, and the ribs are also protecting it quite a bit. This muscle, that is the diaphragm, right, the diaphragm. So it's coming up right up underneath the rib cage, if you will, right, the diaphragm. And then the xiphoid process, man, that thing can cause trouble, can't it? Now, if you look at some of the skeletons we have in the room, especially the real ones, the 2 or 3 real skeletons we have, you'll notice that each one has a slightly different shaped thoracic cavity, that the rib cage is a little bit unique to each person, the sternum is unique, and even the pointiness of the xiphoid is rather unique. Some xiphoids are rather rounded, some are much more pointy. And that pointy xiphoid can be an issue because should you get hit at just the right angle and that little xiphoid process is more pointy, you can see that right behind it, right behind the xiphoid is what? Some of that aorta, right? And so if you have a nice pointy xiphoid and you rupture that thing and it severs the aorta, it's been nice knowing you. Okay? Okay, so we can see it's pointing down, right, to the left, and you can't appreciate it here, but it's pointing a little bit toward the front anteriorly. Taking a look at a cadaver, I would never ask you to label these structures, but you can appreciate some of this now from a different perspective. If we take a look, the diaphragm would be here. The heart's sitting right on the diaphragm. In fact, part of that pericardium, the sac around the heart, is attached right to the diaphragm. So there's definitely a connection there. If you're looking straight at the heart, so the chest is opened up, you're looking at someone, and you look straight at the heart, the first or the most anterior large vessel coming off is going to be the pulmonary trunk. The pulmonary trunk is a little bit more anterior. And then the aorta is up here, and what you can't appreciate, it comes up and it flips, and we can't see the flip. And internally, remember that aorta came up around behind the pulmonary trunk, comes up and around. And on this, you can even see the branches. So right here, first branch coming off, again, that's your brachiocephalic trunk. You can see it branching up and then going over to the subclavian. Here's your left common carotid going up, and we really can't see the third branch, but the left subclavian coming off the aortic arch. You can tell this guy was a smoker, right? We got some black lungs. Now let's take a look at a cartoon that I would more likely have you label. Make sure you're familiar with some of these very clear images. In a moment, we're going to take a slice, as we can see here, and we're going to lay this down. But if I take a slice right across here, I'm going to pick up some of the aortic arch. Again, you can see the apex of the heart. You can see the pericardium. So there is definitely a sac that goes around the heart. And you can see that that sac is directly attached to the diaphragm. You can appreciate, too, that the left lung is smaller and has an indentation, not so great here, called the cardiac notch. And that's going to make room for the heart and leave the left lung with only 2 lobes. The right lung will be larger, and we'll have three lobes. So let's take a cut right across, like that line is here, and let's take a look at what we would see. So we're looking down on a cross-section view, and there's the sternum. Okay, some ribs. Remember, we cut right through the aortic arch, so there's the aortic arch. What's this right here? This is that blue is the pulmonary trunk, which will then split into the pulmonary arteries, left and right. Aortic arch coming up and around. What is this flattened thing back here? Yeah, the esophagus, right? Does that make sense? Now, remember I told you last week how how dorsal the esophagus is? It's very much right along your vertebra, and again, you can appreciate just how dorsal it is. You can see the two lungs. That's really all we can appreciate here. There's our little spinal cord that we know and love so well. We know from the lab number 2 that there are layers around the heart. The serous membrane around the heart we know as the pericardium. 2 layers, right? Visceral and parietal. Did that ever bother anybody? That we have the visceral layer, right? Visceral layer makes sense, on the organ, shrink wrapped to the surface of the heart itself. And a parietal layer. What's parietal mean? On the wall. Think about it for a second. Go back to the pleura. Can you picture the pleura? It's shrink wrapped on the lung, the visceral layer. The parietal layer is where? Lining the thoracic cavity. Okay? Peritoneum. Visceral layer on the gut organs. Parietal layer lining the abdominal pelvic cavity. Right? So far, so good. Pericardium. Visceral layer on the heart. Parietal layer. What wall is the parietal pericardium on? Was anyone ever troubled by that? Okay. Maybe now you'll understand. There is a sac around the heart called the pericardium. The sac around the heart is more than what I described. It is not just a double-layered serous membrane. There is, in addition, around your heart, a fibrous sac. And it is lining the inside of that leather sac, right? Think leather. It's quite a tough little case. It's within inside of that leathery, fibrous sac that you have the parietal layer lining the inside of the sac. Okay, I'll help you with that as we tear this apart a little bit. Now, what the pericardium is doing is it does create layers around the heart, but it also creates a immovable structure, if you will. So that pericardium, that sac, as I showed you a moment ago, is attached to the diaphragm. And we'll also see in another moment that the pericardium is also attached to the sternum. So what is that doing? It's holding the heart in place. So this sac is going to make sure the heart doesn't move around too much. It's going to restrict the heart movements, but it's also going to prevent the heart from overfilling. We'll talk more about this next semester, but the heart, is going to be filling up with blood and being stretched as it contracts and relaxes. And there's a limit to how big the heart can grow and how much blood the heart can pump at one time, in part because of the restriction of the size from this fibrous pericardium. So as I mentioned, the pericardium, the fibrous portion, is going to be attached directly to the sternum in part and to the diaphragm. The inner portions we already know, right? The inner portion, the serous part of the pericardium, we've already imagined. Again, the visceral layer on the shrink wrap to the heart itself. The other name for that was the epicardium. I'll mention that again in a moment. Remember, though, the visceral pericardium is also called the epicardium. And the parietal layer, that layer that lines the wall, now perhaps the mystery is solved. We're lining the inside of this fibrous capsule, this fibrous leather-like sac that's holding the heart in place. Does that make sense? Everyone picturing that a little bit better? There's a slide coming up that may really solidify that for you. Now, the heart wall, we know the heart is hollow, and the heart wall itself is made up of 3 distinct layers. This is not difficult at all. The more external layer is the epicardium. Again, we just call that AKA the visceral pericardium. Same thing. Epicardium, AKA visceral pericardium. The thick muscle layer of the heart, thicker certainly in the ventricles and the atria, but that thicker middle layer is the myocardium, muscle of the heart, myo. And the inner layer is the endocardium, right? It's going to be lining the inside of the chambers where blood would be, as well as the valves. As we age, our heart is naturally going to get more fat deposited in the epicardium. So the outer layer will get a little bit thicker. I'll show you a cartoon of that in a moment, and a little bit fattier as well. Let's look at this and make sure we've got this. The bottom. There's the diaphragm. And as you can see, the heart is directly connected through that fibrous pericardium to the diaphragm. And let's zoom in here. So you see the outer layer, and then you also see the inner layer. Let's zoom in. So the outer layer, the white, is that fibrous pericardium. It's going all the way around the heart, creating that fibrous leather-like sac. Then, deep to that, then you're going to have your parietal layer. So the parietal layer is what? It's going to be lining that fibrous pericardium. And then the visceral layer will be shrink wrapped to the heart itself. Okay. So really the pericardium is a 3-layered membrane. The visceral and parietal layers, as we were imagining since Lab 2, with an additional outer fibrous, thicker sac. While I'm here, let's name a couple things. So name for me these muscles. Papillary muscles. The tendinous cords are the chordae tendineae. What valve is this? I heard mitral. It's correct. Also called the left atrioventricular or the bicuspid, right? So we're on the left side. We know we're on the left side because we have really, really thick myocardium, right? So this is really, really thick muscle going around the left side. So that makes this what chamber? Left ventricle. This is the left atrium. Coming in are what? Pulmonary veins. This valve, aortic semilunar valve, right? And it's going to go up and out and flip back behind and come up the aorta. This blue right here would be a what? Pulmonary artery, right? Pulmonary artery. Good. It's good to be.
Those are switched though, the colors.
Yes. So the pulmonary arteries are going to be red. The pulmonary veins are going to. Pulmonary arteries are going to be blue. Sorry. The pulmonary arteries are going to be red. Make sure I didn't speak anything backwards there. So these red structures are pulmonary veins. They're coming back from the lung, and they're dumping into the left atrium, and they're bringing oxygenated blood. Going away from the right side, we can't see it all, but coming up and then out would be pulmonary arteries going away from the heart. They're leaving the right side of the heart. They're heading toward the lungs and pulmonary arteries. This is the slide you've already seen in lab. So again, the epicardium, the outermost layer, the myocardium. If someone has an MI, they've had a heart attack, a myocardial infarction. And then the internal layer, the endocardium, which can be damaged pretty easily by a viral or bacterial infection. If someone has an endocarditis, that inflammation and the bacteria can cause damage to the valves, which can be really important to the functioning of the heart. So an endocarditis, long-term infection, or difficulty getting rid of that infection can be very detrimental to the heart. Taking a look, just take a chunk out of the heart. So look at our layers. The fatty layer would be actually the outer layer is the epicardium, isn't it? And I told you that that layer gets a little thicker with some fat as we age. So the layer underneath the epicardium going down to the myocardium thickens a little bit. Then all of the heart muscle, right, there's your myocardium. What kind of muscle do we find in here? That's cardiac muscle, right? Now, how are you going to recognize cardiac muscle? It's going to have those lovely striations and the presence of intercalated discs, right? So again, we'll review that with you, but you're going to recognize cardiac muscle from the presence of striations. You can see them, right? Stripes. And you can also see the lines in here. These are the intercalated discs. And then the inner layer is the endocardium. That's also connective tissue. So just a reminder about cardiac muscle. If you were going to compare cardiac muscle with skeletal muscle, they're both striated. Cardiac muscle is involuntary, whereas skeletal muscle is going to be voluntary. Structurally, though, remember that skeletal muscle is multinucleated, that you have a bunch of cells that link together and the nuclei are maintained, and so a long skeletal muscle has many, many nuclei. Cardiac muscle, one, sometimes two, right? Nuclei, and lots of mitochondria, because this is a very energy-needy tissue, so you're going to have a lot of ATP production going on in cardiac muscle, so you're going to have a large number of mitochondria. Now, the fibers are arranged in spiral bundles. Now, when I say the word fibers here and here, what is a muscle fiber? A muscle fiber is the same as a muscle cell, right? So when I'm saying the word fiber here, I'm referring to the entire cells. The cardiac muscle cells are Y-branched with striations and intercalated discs. The cells themselves are bundled in spiral arrangements. And what these are going to do is that when the heart squeezes, the heart is going to squeeze much like a mop being wrung out. So it's going to squeeze and twist. And we'll see the significance of that as the heart is beating. It's going to squeeze and twist the blood out, because where does the blood have to leave out of the ventricle? Up and out, right? The pulmonary trunk and the aorta are at the base. So when the ventricles squeeze, they have to squeeze under a lot of power and pressure and wring out the heart, if you will, and push that blood up and out through those semilunar valves. The heart is going to work as a unit. All the cells in the ventricles, all of the fibers, again, the word fibers meaning cells, all the fibers are going to contract at the same time, essentially, and are going to act in concert. And this is going to be important, because we want all the cells squeezing simultaneously so that the heart is cooperating and the blood is being pushed out. So as we describe the heart cycle today, we're going to see that the two atria are going to squeeze at the same time, and then shortly thereafter both ventricles will squeeze. And there has to be an alternating contraction of these chambers in order for the heart to work properly. Finally, as we've already said, and I always say if I'm on Jeopardy and they ask me a question about the heart and I'm not sure, my answer is always going to be intercalated discs. Right? That's my Jeopardy answer for anything with the heart. So Leonardo da Vinci is my historical guy. He did everything it seems, right? And intercalated discs will be my Jeopardy answer for the heart. So when in doubt, put down intercalated discs. Because again, what are they doing? They're allowing for the rapid electrical signal to be sent through all the cells so that all of the cells can act in concert. And those intercalated discs are a combination of electrical synapse. What's an electrical synapse? Chemical synapses are where chemicals are involved and neurotransmitters are released. Electrical synapses are where two cells come together and electrical current can travel from one cell directly into the next. And that is very common in cardiac muscle and is allowed or facilitated by these intercalated discs. So a cartoon of cardiac muscle. Again, sometimes artists will draw intercalated discs like they're part of an Etch-a-Sketch. And this author represents intercalated discs more as a little squiggle. Okay, but regardless, right, those are the intercalated discs, the dividers between the cells. And you can see the striations, right? You can see the strong striation patterns. And I told you in the previous slide that cardiac muscle cells tend to have little Y-shaped branches, and that's obvious here. Inside, all these little green beans are mitochondria, so lots of mitochondria. And then this slide gives us a little bit more detail about what an intercalated disc actually is. An intercalated disc is really a combination of a desmosome and a gap junction. Now, those are two terms we have not seen for a while. We talked about those back in the skin unit, and they were both different types of intercellular junctions. And what were gap junctions? Do you remember? Gap junctions were connections between epithelial cells where little connexon proteins made like a little gap so that molecules could go from one cell into the next cell. Lateral movement of molecules. And desmosomes were those little button-like snap structures found in areas of high stress. So what an intercalated disc is really a combination of a gap junction and a desmosome. It's a place where molecules, in this case not molecules but electrical current, can travel from one cell directly into the next. And desmosomes, which were places of high stress, and I think you would agree that the heart constantly beating and contracting is a place of rather high stress. So we've got this extra reinforcement from the desmosome and the electrical current being able to transfer cell to cell through the gap junctions. Collectively, we call that an intercalated disc. You are not going to go back and review A, I, M, Z, and Q, all that stuff. No, not at all. Right? Just remember that cardiac muscle is striated, and we're reminded that that striation, the striations we see, we know are what? The overlapping actin and myosin myofilaments, right? Those filaments that are allowing to slide over each other. Other than that, I'm not going to have you look at this. We know what cardiac muscle looks like. Again, there are some of those intercalated discs in the light microscopy. That's all I'm going to say about cardiac muscle. Just make sure you can recognize it. Now, we know the heart is 4 chambers, 2 atria, which are smaller, 2 larger ventricles. The atria are thinner walled chambers. They're located more superiorly. External to the atria, there are these flap-like wrinkled structures called auricles. We know auricle means like the flappy part of our ear, so we're reminded of that. The heart has 2 flappy structures as well. The atria are the receiving chambers, we know this, and the right atrium is going to receive blood from where? Yeah, the vena cava, right? So it's coming in from the body, it's coming in from the systemic circulation. It is blue, right? It has dropped off its oxygen, it's coming back, ready to be regenerated. The left atrium is bringing blood back in from the pulmonary side. This blood is coming back into the left atrium, freshly oxygenated, comes in through pulmonary veins, and is bright red, isn't it? I just keep saying the same thing over and over, don't I? It's the same stuff. I'm saying in a different order, but it's the same material. Now, the blood that comes in on one side of the heart, that comes into one atrium, is going to travel down to the ventricle on the same side. So the right and left heart are pretty much separate side-by-side pumps. Now, that wasn't the case during fetal development, right? During the fetal development, there was a hole in the middle, the foramen ovale, which allowed blood to go from the right to the left side. However, in the adult heart, in your heart, the 2 sides really are working rather separately. The blood's not crossing over, although they are highly synchronized in that the same volume must be pumped from both sides. The 2 arteries leaving the heart, we know this, from the base are the pulmonary trunk and the aorta. That pulmonary trunk, we know, is going to split to the pulmonary arteries, carry blue blood off to the lungs. The aorta is going to carry blood away, red blood away to all of our systemic, or to our systems, to our body. Let's take a look at a few structures here. I'm going to point, and you tell me what I'm pointing to. Pulmonary trunk. Try not to look, just try to follow along. Pulmonary artery, as with this over here, right? Pulmonary arteries. Aorta. You might hear some even say the ascending aorta as it's going up, then the aortic arch, and then after that the descending aorta. You might hear it called the thoracic aorta as long as it stays up in the thoracic area. You might see its name change to the abdominal aorta once it breaks down through the diaphragm to the abdominal pelvic cavity, okay? But all of it's the aorta, right? It's not wrong to say aorta, but if it tells you ascending or descending or abdominal or thoracic aorta, it's giving you a more specific region of the aorta. Question?
That was my question, where actually does the descending part start? Would we be
At the
talking-
top of the arch. So the arch, so everything from the downward turn would be the descending aorta. You could call it descending aorta all the way from the arch to where it splits to the common iliac arteries. But you may also read about thoracic or abdominal aorta, just giving you more pinpointed information about where you're discussing the aorta.
I had it separated at the diaphragm, the abdominal aorta.
And the thoracic aorta.
Yep.
But they're both descending. Okay? So both the thoracic and the abdominal aorta could be called collectively the descending aorta. It's just slightly different labeling. This flappy structure is the left auricle. Let's get our directions on the heart. Okay, so that's the left auricle. Now, how can we always tell? The apex is always pointing on, or is always on the left side. So that gives you your orientation immediately. So that would be the left auricle. This would be the right auricle. Now, deep to the auricles, there I would find the chambers, the atria, right, plural, the right and left atria. On the surface of the heart, I see a bunch of red arteries. Those are the coronary arteries. I also see a series of blue cardiac veins, right? I don't know why they call them differently. We've got coronary arteries and cardiac veins. I wish they were both just cardiac or they're both just coronary. Coming up, inferior vena cava, superior vena cava. And honestly, that's pretty good. Now, there are some grooves. There's a groove that kind of goes around the heart at this angle. Okay, it kind of comes around like this. And that groove is a sulcus, and your Amer book called that the coronary sulcus. It's really an outward groove around the whole heart that separates the upper atria from the lower ventricles. Another name for that, though, is the no, that's not it. Where'd it go? On here. They may not be labeling it on here. Another name for that, though, is the atrioventricular sulcus, right? Atrioventricular, separating the atria from the ventricles. That's the same as the coronary sulcus. So there's, right there, coronary sulcus is that groove. Okay, question?
If you were to turn the heart around, would you still be able to see those, or would they be, I guess I'm looking at it and thinking, looking at how the superior and inferior vena cava both go into the same, they're both going
They're both
opposite
traveling to,
directions.
right, so
They're the same, I guess,
so the superior vena cava is coming down,
okay.
right? Oops, it's coming down. It's draining into, behind this is the right atrium. The inferior vena cava is coming up and also draining into that, into the right atrium.
Okay, I guess I thought it was going into the ventricle for some
Nope,
reason.
remember both of the vena cava are dumping into the right atrium.
So if you turn the heart around,
Yes.
you wouldn't see those structures there.
Let's do
It's not
that.
like
In a
it
moment,
was-
I'm going to show you the heart from the other side.
Okay.
Okay, and maybe that'll help you see this. So you definitely want to spend a few minutes with the heart model upstairs. It's going to help you on the quiz. It's going to help you in the lab practical in 2 weeks. It's going to help you just in your overall appreciation of the three-dimensional structures of the heart. You've got your square heart. That's a good place to start, that whole story. But then actually interacting with the heart and doing what I just did. Just touch, touch, touch different regions and make sure you can name them. Looking at an actual heart, again, let's just name a couple things. I wouldn't have you label this, but we can get away with a couple of these things. That is the apex. If I stuck a scalpel right into there, I would be in the left ventricle, right? So that makes this area over here the right ventricle. There's my flappy. So underneath that is the right atrium. There's my left flappy, the left auricle. So below that would be the left atrium. The more anterior great vessel, this is the pulmonary trunk, whereas the aorta kind of goes back behind and then comes up, and that is a little bit more deep, a little more pushed back a little bit. And then I can even see there's a big old branch. That would be the brachiocephalic trunk. Here's a skinny little branch coming off. That would be the left common carotid, and maybe we can imagine there's a third little branch right there. That'd be the left subclavian. The atria are separated from the ventricles externally by the coronary sulcus. So I just mentioned that, also called the atrioventricular sulcus. It extends around the entire circumference of the heart, sort of as a oblique belt. And then on the anterior and on the posterior sides, there are interventricular sulci. Again, grooves that basically run between the ventricles, interventricular. One in the front, one on the back side. We already know about the apex, that nice pointy structure. So let's take a look from the back, okay? So I think this is going to help you. So taking a look at this from a posterior view of the heart. Let's do the same thing. Let's label some things. So coming down. Superior vena cava coming up, and both draining into the right atrium. Okay? Now, this would be the what? Aortic arch, brachiocephalic trunk, right? First branch, left common carotid, left subclavian. These blue guys, pulmonary arteries. What's coming in here? 4 of them. Pulmonary veins. On the heart model upstairs, this is the back door that flaps open. All right, so that is the left atrium, okay, the left atrium, and in our models it kind of opens downward. The model opens up. This blue collection vein is better known as the coronary sinus. And notice that the coronary sinus is embedded within this coronary sulcus. On the back side, posterior interventricular sulcus, this groove that all those coronary arteries are finding themselves in. And the same was true, there's an anterior interventricular sulcus. We're making good sense of the overall structure. Again, it takes a little while to get that red and blue story and get the orientation, and then once you get it, you'll be able to figure it out. I'll never, again, I wouldn't give you this structure to look at, but you can appreciate this opening here. What's missing here is the inferior vena cava. There's the opening for it going into the right atrium. Coming down, hard to see, but in fact I don't even see it on here at all. The superior vena cava is kind of hidden here. I'm not going to have you label any of this. The coronary sinus, there's a larger vessel right here. That's that collection area for all the blue blood coming back from the cardiac veins. Question?
So that aorta then comes down behind it if it were to continue and the head and
It does.
neck comes straight
It
down?
does.
Okay.
So the aorta goes up, the arch comes down on the posterior side of the heart, and in all the drawings you'll see where it comes down, below it. You'll see it in all the cartoons, the one you labeled as well. So not only is the heart surrounded by a fibrous sac, pericardium, but the heart, being a hollow organ with 4 chambers, must also have an internal skeleton. And this is not something we could label necessarily on our heart models. But I want you to realize that in between the atria and the ventricles, there is a layer of dense, irregular connective tissue, and this is called the fibrous skeleton. It is going to physically separate the atria from the ventricles on the inside, right? So we've been talking about a sulcus on the outside, but this is literally a connective tissue structure that's going to give the heart its structure, give it its skeleton. And not only is this going to physically separate the atria from the ventricles, but it's also going to give a structure for all four valves to embed into, to maintain. Up till now, I said that the chordae tendineae were very important, and they are, for maintaining the valve. But what keeps the valve in its anatomical position is going to be the fibrous skeleton. It's also going to provide, this skeleton is also providing an electrical insulation so that the atria can squeeze, and then shortly thereafter the ventricles will squeeze. If all four chambers were squeezing at the same time, our heart would not be working well. So we need for there to be a delay in the squeezing of the two atria and then the two ventricles. We'll talk a lot more about that next semester. And so this fibrous skeleton is giving us a framework. I have never, ever seen this in the real world. This is a beautiful artist's rendition of this fibrous skeleton. But theoretically, I mean, this is real, but I've never seen this white framework quite the way this is showing. Theoretically, though, if you were to slice your heart next week, you're going to get a heart when we're dissecting the hearts and the lungs next week. And you could actually slice right where this green plane is. And theoretically hit it just right and lay it down and now see all four valves in the same plane. And all four of those valves are embedded now in this fibrous skeleton. Which of these must be the bicuspid? I mean, doesn't it look like you're looking in the mouth? Like a bicuspid tooth, right? And that looks like a molar or some tricuspid, right? So the bicuspid, I get no problem with that naming, right? The bicuspid and the tricuspid make sense to me, right? 2 points and 3 points, easy. So this must be the left side and this must be the right side. But I still don't see anything half moon looking here, right? The semilunar valves still don't look anything half moonish like to me. But the point here is that you can see all four valves in one slice, one plane, being held in place by the fibrous skeleton. So all that white stuff, right, around all the four valves is the fibrous skeleton. Now this is where I'm actually going to do a big jump over, and then I'm going to draw the square heart on the screen here. So let me just run through this quickly. We know there are four chambers. And we know that there are valves that are going to keep everything moving in the right direction. And I think right now I'll go ahead and just turn this off for a second and go through this basically in memory as I go through this. So I'm going to draw my square heart out. So almost there. So here we go. You can follow along. Okay. And what did I say? That we have four chambers here, right? And those four chambers are the right atrium, left atrium, right ventricle, left ventricle. Blood comes in to the right atrium by one of three ways. You tell me. Superior vena cava, inferior vena cava, coronary sinus. Can we picture those three things? Right? Blood's going to come down through the right atrium, go through this valve. This valve is the tricuspid or the right AV, right? The right atrioventricular valve. Continuing down into the right ventricle, what will I find in the right ventricle? On the wall, some papillary muscles, to which are attached the chordae tendineae, right? The blood is going to leave out this right ventricle through this valve. That valve is the pulmonary semilunar valve. The blood will now be in what vessel? Pulmonary trunk, which will then split into the right and left pulmonary arteries. This is still blue blood being carried. This blood is going to find its way where? To the lungs. And what's going to happen there? Gas exchange. Blue will now become red. So I'm going to just go ahead and call that purple blood because it's in the lungs that we're going to get blue dropped off and red picked up. Blood is now going to come back through a series of what? Pulmonary veins, right? Bringing red blood back. Pulmonary veins. Comes into the left atrium, down through this valve. That is our bicuspid, mitral, or the left AV. Continuing down, everything's the same on the left side, right? Except it's a thicker chamber, isn't it? So I won't draw that because it's just hard, but remember this is going to be a thicker myocardium to represent that thicker wall. And also I'm going to round this edge because that rounded edge represents the apex of the heart. We still have the papillary muscles. We still have the chordae tendineae. Nothing's changed. Leaving the left side, not down here, but at the base, because remember the heart's going to squeeze and push blood up in a kind of a ringing action up and out the base. But I have it labeled here for my own sanity. So we have the aorta going off to whatever tissue you want to call it, right? To your hands, to any tissue in your body. Every body tissue is going to get oxygen via these arteries off the aorta. And eventually, wherever we are in the body, there's going to be, again, purple. And that purple is going to represent what? Wherever we go, we're going to have a purple tissue. And that purple represents now the dropping off of oxygen and the picking up of CO2. And then eventually, all that blood is going to return back to the body. And if it's coming from the head or the hands, it would drain back into the superior vena cava. If it's coming from the trunk or the legs to the inferior vena cava, from the heart muscle itself, it would be going back to the, or coming back in from the coronary sinus.
Where does the aortic arch come in?
Aortic arch on this drawing does not, right? Now keep in mind that what I should be drawing is this, which is even worse perhaps, right? Right? And if this was my heart, then my aorta would be coming off where? Right? It would be coming back behind, wouldn't it? Okay? That is the extent of my artistic skills. It's not even an option. I mean, I can slow down and it's just as ugly. It just doesn't matter. So for those who have the artistic skill and are just completely disgusted by my drawings, I understand. I am too. Okay, but the aortic arch, right, does not really apply to the square heart because the aorta really is coming off the base, off the top, and back up and around. Anything else to clarify from the square heart?
That's actually another valve though, there, right?
Ah, thank you. I did not, absolutely. So there is the aortic semilunar valve, thank you, coming off from the aorta, going from the left ventricle into the aorta. Thank you. Anything else to clarify from the little square heart? Again, it's something you can quickly sketch out. A lot of students on their exam next week will turn it over and in the first minute just dump a square heart and draw it out and then refer back to it because many of the questions on the exam will say, okay, where are you now? What chamber are you in? What value are you heading through? You know, what color would this blood be? So if you know this really, really well, it'll give you a lot of points. Absolutely a lot of points. Okay. So these slides through here are ones that we've already been through. I'm going to skip through them and then give you a little break, but I just want to make sure there's nothing on here I don't need to say again. Again, we have the right AV valve, aka the tricuspid. I want to say too that these valves do not open and close on their own. This is not like the doors, like the big rotating doors in a big hotel or in a big convention center. These valves only open when they're pushed. And the reason they're pushed is because the heart is squeezing and the blood is being pushed under pressure. So, and I'll mention that again in a moment, but these valves are not opening and closing like some mechanical cuckoo clock, okay? They're only opening and closing when they are literally pushed by the pressure of the blood, by the squeezing of the heart. So we're in the right ventricle. Again, this is all blue blood on the right side. The interventricular septum, can you picture it? Interatrial septum between the atria, the interventricular septum between the two ventricles. The papillary muscles, the chordae tendineae, out the pulmonary trunk, splits into the pulmonary arteries. I have not mentioned the conus arteriosus, so you can cross that term off. Haven't mentioned it at all, so don't be sidelined by the conus arteriosus. Out the pulmonary trunk, pulmonary arteries, off to the lung. When we open this up, let me make sure you can name the 4 valves. This valve, it's been sliced open, right? But that valve is the right atrioventricular or the tricuspid. This valve, mitral, bicuspid, left AV valve. The one behind, aortic, again it goes back behind and then up. And then this is the pulmonary semilunar valve. This is the opening for the inferior vena cava dumping into the right atrium. That little pencil eraser shaped opening is the opening for the what? Coronary sinus. Remember, blood comes into the right atrium one of 3 ways. So you've got blood coming down from the inferior, up from the inferior, down from the superior, and then draining back in from the coronary sinus into the right atrium by that little opening that you see in the right atrium. Finally, what is this indentation here? That indentation is the, am I hearing fossa ovalis? Right, the fossa ovalis, that indentation that reminds us that as a fetus, our heart had there not a flattened surface, but instead an opening, a foramen, oval-shaped foramen, the foramen ovale. Okay, so we're back in. Again, we're flowing through the left atrium as we've already been through this. Everything's pretty much the same. I did not, just for clarification, I have not mentioned the pectinate muscles. So again, don't focus on that. You'll see it labeled on every image, but I did not describe it, so we'll skip that this semester. The left AV valve, aka the mitral bicuspid, chordae tendineae, all that looks and feels the same over the left side. Leaving out the left ventricle, which is the largest of the 4 chambers, much more muscular, myocardium. It has to work the hardest because this is the chamber that's going to force blood out to your brain. Again, don't worry about the trabeculae. That's another term I did not mention this semester. So the trabeculae carneae, don't worry about that. We still have the papillary muscles and the chordae tendineae over here. If I slice open the heart in this cartoon rendering, what do I see? I know exactly where I am. The point, the apex tells me I'm on the left side. Looking at the thickness of this muscle, I also know I'm on the left side. So a much thicker left ventricle wall. The right side, rather wimpy in its muscularity. It doesn't have to be as muscular, does it? Because it's only pumping blood over to the lungs. So it's not very far. It's not under as much pressure. And then this little table just goes through, if you like tables, and I like tables, so I include them. But again, the 4 heart valves, nothing on here, there's nothing additional here that you need to know. It just reminds you of the location, the overall looking structure, and what each of these valves is preventing as far as backflow. If you like the square heart, great. If you don't like it, you can make a flow chart as well. So this flow chart, you also saw it in the lab, and it gives you the same story. Or if you're artistically skilled, you can draw out the more anatomically correct heart. I'm going to stop there unless there's any questions about the overall flow, and we'll come back in about 5 or 6 minutes and we'll pick up on the cardiac cycle. So all we have left now are just a few more ideas about the heart, and we'll pick up with the cardiac cycle. So hopefully you now are feeling really, really comfortable with the structures of the heart, that you can look at any image from front or back and identify the aorta, the valves, what chamber you're in, and if you're still not there, just go back and practice. I know it just takes a few more times to really get that three-dimensional understanding of the heart. Once you have it, you will have it. Now let's talk about a little bit of physiology. We're not going to dive into this terribly hard, but I want you to appreciate, and you know this, that the heart is beating about 75 times or so per minute, and therefore there is a cycle of activity, a cycle of events happening inside the heart. And we're going to call this the cardiac cycle from the beginning of one heartbeat until the next heartbeat is initiated. And during this cardiac cycle, all of the chambers within the heart will undergo an alternating period of contraction and relaxation. So all 4 chambers will be squeezing and relaxing. Now here's that word that I promised you. The contraction of a chamber is referred to as systole, or the systolic pressure, the systolic event. Systole means contraction. And it's during systole that the heart is squeezing, or that chamber is squeezing, and it's during that time that the blood will be under pressure, pushed up and out, and force open the valve. These valves are like swinging saloon doors, right? They're going to only open when they're pushed open by something forcing it open. Again, they're not like some mechanical cuckoo clock where the doors open and close on some scheduled event, right? So the valves are only being pushed open by the contraction of the blood. Then the relaxation phase is the diastole or the diastolic, and this is the time when the chamber is not contracting, and also the time when that chamber is filling back up with blood. So when the heart is contracting, it's pushing blood out. When the heart is relaxing, it's filling, right? It's receiving blood during these periods of relaxation. Now, I know this is a little bit small, but this one's a really important slide, but you're only going to focus on about half of it. I don't want you worrying about any of this over here at all. So we're only going to look at these on the first left side of this image. And let's take a look at this together. So we'll start off with, and this says atria, right? So this is what's going on with the atrial systole. That is, the atria are doing what? Contracting, right? The atria are squeezing. Now, are the atria very muscular? Right? They're not very muscular, but they are going to squeeze a little bit. And as the atria squeeze, left and right are going to squeeze at the same time. Where's that blood going? Down to the ventricle, right? So that means, okay, so during atrial systole, the atria are contracting, got it? The ventricles would be relaxed because they're the chambers receiving the blood. They're relaxed at that moment. And what must be open for that to happen? What valve must be pushed open when the atria are squeezing so the blood can go down to the ventricles? And you're all saying the AV valves, right? Left and right, AV valves, or the mitral, or the bicuspid, tricuspid, whatever. But these are all the AV valves and their associated names. Can you picture it? What valves would be closed? The semilunars. So when the atria are squeezing, We're squeezing the atria. The ventricles are receiving that blood. To receive that blood, the AV valves had to have been pushed open. And I'll tell you now that the other valves, the semilunar valves, are closed. Okay. Now, let's go over to this big box. And all of this is ventricular systole. Okay? Ventricular systole. What's happening when the ventricles are squeezing? What's happening when the ventricles are in contraction? Okay, think about it. Well, the ventricles are contracting, it tells us that. The atria would be, at that same time, relaxing, right? They would be in a time of diastole, where they're relaxing. When the ventricles are squeezing and forcefully pushing blood up and out, what valves are they going to push open? Semilunar valves, right? They're going to push open those semilunar valves. And what valves would be, therefore, closed? AV valves. What if the AV valves didn't close? I heard murmur. Exactly right. If the AV valves didn't close, then when the ventricles squeeze, where would blood go? It wouldn't necessarily go up and out the semilunar valves. It would go right back up into the atria.
Is that what they mean when they hear regurgitation?
That's the regurgitation. That's the murmur. So when they hear blood, and it literally sounds like something's regurgitating. Something's gurgling when you listen to it at the stethoscope. Okay, so you don't have to worry about that, but you'll hear the regurgitation word used. And that is the blood moving backwards. It's going back through the valve the wrong way. It's going back up through the AV valve. Blood's going the wrong direction. Right? We don't want a lot of that going on, do we? Because if we don't have enough blood going forward, then we're not getting the right oxygenated blood to the rest of the body. So a little bit of blood going back, a little murmur, okay, we'll watch it. Again, if it gets worse, then it becomes significant blood flow is not going the right direction, the body's not getting the adequate oxygen that it needs, and we might have to do some surgical interventions. So on this other side, we're not going to worry about this other side, okay? All I want you to know, so don't worry about any of this, all I want you to know is just what's in those two boxes, if you will. If you understand that, then we're in good shape when it comes to this cardiac cycle idea. What do you think? Does that make sense? That only makes sense if you understand the anatomy, right? Which valves are being pushed open, which valves would therefore be closed. It only makes sense in light of understanding the valves and the chambers. Yes?
The right ventricle is pushing up as well.
The right ventricle, yes, pushing up and out through the pulmonary.
Why does it take more muscle for the left ventricle to push out the aortic valve if the right ventricle is going up as well?
It's not about the pressure needed to get it through the valve. It's about the distance that the blood has to travel. So the right side only has to go from the heart a few inches over to the lung. It doesn't need as much pressure and power to do so. The left side must pump the blood up into my brain and down to my big toe and to my kidneys and every other organ in between. So it's about the pressure necessary to get it delivered, not about the pressure needed to blow open the valve. Okay? The valves are not any tighter or looser, but it's about the pressure necessary to send the blood to its destinations. So that's why the left side has to be so much more powerful. Make sense?
Yeah, I was just looking at also the pulmonary breaks off into the left and the right side.
Right, so the pulmonary trunk goes up and breaks into the right and left pulmonary arteries, again going off to the lungs. Not very far away. Not very far away at all, a few inches. Now the heart is really cool, and we'll dive into this story in hideous detail next semester. But the heart is autorhythmic. You can take the heart out of the body. You can separate the heart from your central nervous system, and the heart will keep on beating. It's kind of eerie, but if you watch any heart transplantation kind of shows on TLC or any of the medical shows, as long as that heart is in a solution of enough calcium and enough sugar and energy, that heart will just keep on beating. And the reason is the heart is autorhythmic. It sets its own pace by an area of the heart called the pacemaker. And we'll dive into this next semester. For all I want you to know right now is that you can separate the heart from the brain and the heart will keep on beating. There are no external nerves coming into the heart that tell it to beat. Now, there are signals coming into the heart that influence the heart rate. Right? The bear walks in the room, the heart rate goes up. When you're relaxed, parasympathetic, the heart rate goes down. So are there influencing nerves going to the heart? Absolutely. But the actual initiation of the heartbeat is coming from a portion of the heart itself called the pacemaker, and we'll dive into that story next semester. This entire nerve pathway within the heart is referred as the cardiac conduction system. And again, we'll have a whole lab on the cardiac conduction system next month, or next semester. As I mentioned, the brain does send signals to the heart. Again, these are involuntary, right? We don't have any voluntary control over this. This is part of your autonomic nervous system, and you do have signals coming from both your sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. Collectively, the nerves traveling to your heart are called the coronary plexus. That word makes sense, right? Coronary going to the heart, plexus, a group of nerves. Now tell me right now which cranial nerve would be involved or be a part of this coronary plexus? Vagus, right? It's the only nerve you know that goes down and goes to the chest. So you know the vagus nerve wanders down to the chest and is part of this whole coronary plexus story. Again, it doesn't set the heartbeat, but it can influence, increase or decrease the heart rate.
Is that why, there was a time where we were putting tubes down my daughter's nose, and we must have stimulated that vagus nerve, and our heart rate changed?
Oh, way up, yeah. Or down, but
Okay.
more than likely
So
up.
even just a sensation of brushing by that can change the rhythm or the
Absolutely,
speed of the heart?
absolutely. No, absolutely. And the body could have been on high alert saying, hey, something's not right here. Yeah, absolutely. So the circulation going to the heart, coronary circulation. And you already know that sitting on the outside of the heart are all these coronary arteries. You've seen them. We're not going to name them. We're just going to call them the coronary arteries. And you see them traveling in the outer epicardial layer and migrating into the myocardium. And if one of those gets blocked, right, what would we call that? If one of those coronary arteries gets blocked, we call that a heart attack, right? If you've got a complete closure of one of these coronary arteries, then the heart muscle, which needs constant energy and constant oxygen, doesn't like it at all. You can go without oxygen to the brain for 4 or 5 minutes before you have irreversible brain damage. It's not much different for the heart, right? The heart just constantly needs that oxygen and that energy. So we're not going to name these, so don't worry about the marginal artery and the posterior interventricular artery. Just know that the right coronary artery branches right off the aortic arch. As soon as blood comes out of the left ventricle, passes by the aortic semilunar valve, and in the ascending aorta, right, on the upward swing, you will see branches coming off the ascending aorta, and those are the right and left coronary arteries. So there's a right and a left. Again, we're not going to worry about the branching and the names, so don't worry about the circumflex. Now, looking at a picture of this, this is a nice little picture that it shows you the heart structure is sort of in the background. And there's the aortic valve. And as soon as blood is coming out of the left ventricle, you can see the left and right coronary arteries carrying the freshest, most oxygenated blood to the heart muscle. Okay. And again, we're not going to worry about the individual names. And then all that blood's going to bring oxygen to the heart muscle, and then those cardiac veins are going to bring the blood back from the cardiac muscle And we've already seen that all of those cardiac veins then do what? They drain into this coronary sinus. And we can see in this drawing that there's a little opening off the coronary sinus where the coronary sinus drains back into the right atrium. So if you had a blockage right there, okay, what would be damaged in your heart? This patch, right, of heart muscle would be damaged, the right ventricle. If you instead had a blockage up here, you've lost all of this, right? So the outcome of a heart attack has a lot to do with where is the blockage, how much of the heart muscle was damaged. Once heart muscle is destroyed, it does not regenerate. So there are not good stem cells within your cardiac muscle, and what is replaced gets replaced as fibrous, fatty, connective tissue, and does not get replaced as conducting or contracting heart muscle. So based upon what you know right now, if you could choose your heart attack, which one would you choose? Which chamber would you choose to have damage to?
Lower ventricles.
So notice there isn't a whole lot of blood flow going to the atria anyway, right? But if you could choose blood flow issues to the, or damage to the right atrium, the left atrium, oh, sorry, that was bad. Left atrium, right ventricle, or left ventricle. Where would you choose? I'm hearing left ventricle. That would personally be my last choice. Why? Why is the left ventricle the last place you want heart damage? That's the workhorse, right? Because if you have damage to the left ventricle, you're not now going to have the forceful contractions necessary to get blood to all of your tissues. So I would not choose left ventricle, right? In fact, one of these vessels in here is called the Widowmaker by nickname because it is not a good outcome when it's blocked. Now, what might be another chance, another choice? So I really don't want my right ventricle either, right? I mean, it's still pretty important to getting blood over to my lungs. I kind of like my oxygen. So now I have a choice between the left ventricle, or the left atrium and the right atrium, right? Now I didn't tell you before, but the right atrium is the area of the heart that has the pacemaker in it. Okay? That's the part of the heart that sets the pace.
So the left atrium.
Well, nowadays, take out my right atrium, right? Because now I can get an artificial pacemaker put in. And I can be like Dick Cheney and live for years and years and years, right? People have pacemakers for decades. So if I were going to choose, and I've asked a cardiologist before, and he kind of said, that's a funny question to ask, but I want you to think about where would be the place of least problem. With technology as it is now, I would rather see my right atrium affected because I know I can get an artificial pacemaker. And as long as that works, right, then I can set the rhythmic pace of my heart and not damage any of the strong muscular portions of my ventricles.
But if it happens like up in the vein of the right atrium, don't you damage the rest of the vein?
Oh, you mean arteries?
Yeah.
Yeah, so absolutely, right. Oh, yeah. And that's why maybe the question doesn't make total sense, because if I blocked here, I'm dead. Right, because if I block and the whole right side of the heart sustains damage to the point where this doesn't work at all, that's not going to be a good outcome. Likewise, if I were to block off way up here in the left coronary artery, not a good outcome. People who survive heart attacks have little tiny blockages here, right, and a little patch here, and a little patch here, and a little patch here. And they go in and they have a quadruple bypass. And they find out through angio studies that they have 4 little blockages or 5 little blockages. And they go in and they do a quintuplet or a quadruple or a triple bypass. And they're going to go in and go around the blockages. Or go in and take a little chicken wire and open up those vessels and keep that from closing down. So a person who goes in for a triple bypass is a very lucky person, right? They found the problem in advance, and they were able to go in and cleanse out or clean out or do the best they can to go around the blockage. Sometimes a person gets a triple bypass because they had some heart pain, and it was a signal to go in and have it checked out. Other times someone may have a small heart attack, and then they find out, oh, you also, by the way, have 3 other blockages. So let's talk about these little blockages. So you'll hear about angina or angina pectoris or myocardial infarction. So coronary heart disease is the leading cause of death in our country, and it's all about the narrowing of the coronary arteries. Now, you could expand this thing to cardiovascular disease is by far the leading cause of death if you included blood vessels going to the brain, right? Blood vessels going to the brain that get blocked, we call a stroke. Blood vessels going to the heart that get blocked, we call a heart attack. And pretty much what's going to cause this is that over time, there's a buildup of lipid, fatty-like materials that make the vessels crunchier and make the lumen, the opening, more narrow, until at some point it closes off. Now, some people will have symptoms before they have a full-fledged heart attack, and that's angina or angina. So during exertion, they're out shoveling the snow or they're exercising, whatever, and they'll feel some pain, and it'll resolve rather quickly, usually. And people would live with angina for years and years. Now, honestly, people, I don't think, live with angina very much anymore, because with medical technology, now if someone has partial closing of an artery, we're going to go in and fix it. We're going to go in and do some angioplasty or some stenting or some bypass surgery. 50 years ago, though, right, a person would suffer from angina, and the only thing we could give them was a medication called nitroglycerin. And it's a little tablet. They'd pop it under their tongue. It would dissolve in their mouth. Nitroglycerin is a vasodilator. So what's it going to do? Open up the blood vessels and allow the blood to flow more completely and without disruption, and they would get past their little angina attack. And then the next time they were exercising, they'd pop another little nitro pill. Again, people don't live with that, not in our country anymore, because we would go in and fix it usually. If you have a complete and total blockage, that's a heart attack. Sudden, complete blockage, and now you're sustaining damage to the heart, and again, it does not regenerate. The scar tissue that is in there is not helping the heart. And so as I was showing you, the outcome of a heart attack has a lot to do with the area, the place, where that blockage is, and how much and how completely the heart was destroyed. Now, this is just a review slide. Again, if you can look at this and make sense of this, and you should be able to now, and go into Martini and find the similar image and follow that blood around and ask yourself, what chamber am I in? What valve am I going through? What color is this blood? Think about the square heart and now transfer it to this image in those 11 steps, and you will be in fantastic shape for the exam. Now, what questions do you have? We still have about 10 minutes, and I do want to jump over. I'll feel better if I can start the conversation on arteries and veins. We won't get very far. But are there any questions right now about the heart attacks, angina, circulation, anything like that?
Is the right ventricle larger because it needs more blood to simultaneously go to both lungs? Is that why that is?
Larger than what?
Well, isn't it the largest?
Left.
Left is
The left ventricle is going to pump.
most blood?
Remember, the volume's the same.
Okay. No, I didn't.
The volume has to be the same, or else it can be a backflow, right? If we were pumping more blood from the left side every single time than the right side, we'd have a backup somewhere with a problem. So the volume has to be the same. What is pumped from the right and the left side must be the same volume. Is it under different pressure? Yes. So the right side is not pumping under as much pressure to the lungs as the left side is to all of your body systems. But the volume must be the same. Now, what happens in a diseased heart is the two sides are not coordinated, right? And after a heart attack, the right side is weaker or the left side is weaker than the other side. And now we start getting issues with the two sides of the heart working together and synchronously. And people will start having fluid buildup in their lungs, or they'll start having fluid buildup in their extremities, which can be another sign of heart disease. So as people get really swollen ankles and swollen legs, ooh, there could be a problem with what? Blood returning to the right side of the heart. So if someone's getting a lot of edema in their lower extremities, their right heart might be weak. If their left side of their heart is weak, it's not pulling the blood back from the lungs very well, they could start getting pulmonary edema. Okay? I'm giving you more than you need to know right now, but in a healthy heart, both sides are working simultaneously, same volumes, otherwise we've got a problem. In a diseased heart, we start seeing imbalances, and now we've got to deal with it. Other questions? This is your chapter 19. Just a few minutes, I'll feel better to know that I got started on this chapter. And this is our last chapter for the exam. So we'll be done with it earlier, a little bit on Wednesday, and we'll be able to get started with a little bit of the respiratory system, I believe. So again, much of this you've heard, although I will say in lab I did skip over many of the details because I knew we would have this opportunity, and that was a very busy lab last week where we did both the vessels, the heart, and the blood. So we know that the blood vessels are carrying oxygen and CO2, nutrients, waste products, hormones, you name it, right? And all that is being pumped around by the heart and sent through all of our tissues. This is a closed loop system. It's continuously being pumped. Our heart, of course, never gets to take a rest. But I want to convince you that these, although it's a continuous system and closed loop, it is not rigid. That is, your body will make decisions if more blood is needed to one organ or to another organ. And we talked about some of that movement, that change, when we talked about the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous systems. You know that when at a time of stress, your brain and your muscles and your heart are going to get more blood, and your reproductive, urinary, and digestive organs will get less. Flip it around after a big meal, right? And you're kind of sitting on the recliner and everything's relaxed. Your brain doesn't get quite as much, and your muscles kind of get lazy. But at that time, your digestive and your urinary and your reproductive organs are able to get more blood. And so, again, this blood is moving around your body as needed. And these blood vessels, we already know their names. We've been learning their names. The naming of the vessels, I hope you're not struggling too much with them. The vessels are named pretty much by the organ that they serve, the bones, or the body parts through which they travel. Not all, but for every artery, there's usually an equally named vein. The major exception that you've seen is that the jugulars are only veins and the carotids are only arteries. And please, please, please don't tell me about carotid veins and jugular arteries. They don't exist. So make sure those two terms are making sense to you. Other than that, almost everything else is duplicated, isn't it? When you look at your lists, there's a femoral artery, there's a femoral vein. There's a common iliac artery, there's a common iliac vein. Most everything is exactly the same name, except the jugulars and the carotids. Systemic circulation, again, carrying blood out to all of your tissues. The pulmonary circulation, only dealing with gas exchange. You also appreciate that there are three different types of vessels, three classes. There are arteries, and by definition, always, always, always carry blood away from the heart, no exceptions. Those arteries are going to get smaller and smaller. They're going to branch, or what we say bifurcate, and as they branch, they're going to get smaller until we eventually get down to the capillaries. Capillaries are not just small arteries. They are their own special class. And maybe somewhere along the way you were taught that capillaries are just small arteries, but they really are not. They're a different structure. We'll look at the differences next time. The capillaries are where the gas and nutrient exchanges, where all the water exchange is going to happen. And then from the capillaries, after that exchange has occurred, this blood is going to return through a series of veins, returning back to the heart. And whereas the arteries get smaller and smaller as they move away from the heart, the veins get bigger and bigger as they come back closer to the heart. And you know that to be true because you have everything coming back in through these two big veins, the inferior and superior vena cava. There are places where vessels merge to supply the same body region. These are called anastomoses. And anastomosis is sort of a generic term where two things, two structures, two vessels come together. And I'll show you a better understanding of an anastomosis next time. It is true that veins tend to form more of these anastomoses than do arteries. So I'm going to introduce the three layers and then we'll be done. So blood vessels as hollow hose-like structures are going to have tunics. The tunic is a name for the layers of the vessels. They're called the tunics or the tunica. And there are three layers. The tunica intima, also referred to as the tunica interna, the inside layer. This is the layer that's touching the blood. This is made up of simple squamous epithelium. And the other name for this simple squamous epithelium is endothelium. If you hear the word endothelium, it's referring to the epithelium inside a blood vessel. Endo, within the vessel. Tunica media, the middle layer of the vessel, is going to be all muscle. So the middle layer is muscle. This is smooth muscle. It is here that the body is able to control blood flow. The smooth muscle can squeeze down to restrict blood flow. The smooth muscle can relax to allow more blood flow. Again, think sympathetic and parasympathetic, vasoconstriction, vasodilation. And then finally, the outer layer is the tunica externa. You'll also hear tunica adventitia. This is pretty much connective tissue, some collagen, some elastin, basically glue that is going to glue the artery or the vein to the part of the body where it's traveling through. So this is what's going to adhere the artery or vein to the body, to the wall, to whatever it is that it's passing through. And in this tunica externa is what is referred to as the vasa vasorum. And the vasa vasorum is, from the Latin, the vessel of the vessels. Vas, vessel of the vessels. And basically these are little vessels outside the big blood vessel that bring nutrients and oxygen to the cells of the blood vessels. What I always forget is that blood vessels are living. They're not just tubes or garden hoses or straws passing through your body. They themselves are also made up of epithelial cells, muscle cells, and fibroblasts making the collagen and the elastin. So we don't want to forget that blood vessels themselves, made of cells, need to have their own blood supply. So we'll pick that up on Wednesday with arteries and veins. As you're looking at this, focus on comparing and contrasting. Compare arteries and veins and capillaries. And I'll be giving you a Venn diagram type thing. Remember that Venn diagram we had? We haven't had a Venn diagram, have we? So we'll have a Venn diagram type thing where I'll have you compare arteries and veins, and I'll highlight that for you on Wednesday.